Hey heroes, and welcome to another interstellar episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale begins in the 1930s with an astronomer named Dr. Raymond Lightner. A respected Nobel Prize-winning scientist, he lived in a mansion in Stony Point, New York with his wife Lucinda. But over time, he grew increasingly reclusive and obsessed with his work. He designed a device called the Sky Cannon, which he believed could tap into the power of the stars to make himself immortal. Things started coming to a head in 1936 when a pregnant Lucinda confronted her husband about his mad ambitions. After Raymond struck her in a fit of rage, Lucinda fled to New York City and sought help from the heroic bronze-skinned adventurer Doc Savage. She told him everything she knew, and soon afterwards the city was plunged into darkness as Lightner's machine drew in the energy needed to power itself up. Savage and his two associates, Monk Mayfair and Rennie Renwick, took off to investigate in their flying vehicle, the Autogyro. However, they reached the skies above Lightner's observatory just as Raymond was firing his cannon, and in an unlikely turn of fate, the star beam bounced off the Autogyro and struck Raymond Lightner, causing both to disappear in a flash of light. While Savage and his associates ultimately resurfaced and had subsequent adventures, Raymond was declared legally dead, and his wife Lucinda gave birth to twin children, Thomas Joseph Lightner and Janice Catherine Lightner. Over the following decades, Thomas Lightner also studied astronomy and earned his PhD in solar physics, but always felt that his own accomplishments were overshadowed by his late father's reputation. He grew increasingly paranoid and resentful as a result, often refusing grants and employment as he suspected they were only offered because of his father's fame. On top of that, he squandered his family's fortune through drinking and gambling, much to his twin sister's dismay. Eventually, history began to repeat itself as Thomas Lightner rebuilt his father's Sky Cannon, intending on using it to infuse himself with alien energies. Janice attempted to talk sense into him, but when Thomas struck his sister in anger, she fled to New York City and sought help from the world-famous adventurers, the Fantastic Four. She spoke with two members of the FF, Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, and Ben Grimm, the Thing, explaining the situation as she understood it. Sure enough, just like before, the island of Manhattan was plunged into darkness, while Lightner Mansion glowed in the distance. And so Johnny and Ben hopped into the flying Fantasticar and flew off to investigate, arriving at the Lightner estate just as the Sky Cannon fired for a second time, inadvertently reflecting the beam back at Thomas Lightner. This bizarre confluence of circumstances created a temporal distortion, causing the moments that Raymond and Thomas Lightner were struck by the star beams to overlap. As a result, father and son were merged into a single entity that dubbed itself Blacksun the Stellar Man. This composite being possessed the power to gravitationally warp time and matter around itself, and could even fire bolts of energy drawn from the dark force dimension, which the Sky Cannon had tapped into. Furthermore, this temporal warp also pulled Doc Savage, Monk Mayfair, and Rennie Renwick into it, and the trio joined forces with the Thing and the Human Torch to oppose Blacksun. While these adventurers of two eras were seemingly no match for their foe, in the ensuing battle, Blacksun continued to draw in energy from the universe itself, until he absorbed more than his body could handle, causing him to collapse. With Blacksun having effectively burnt himself out in his hubris, the temporal distortion surrounding him faded. Doc Savage and his associates returned to 1936, and any trace of Raymond Lightner faded from Blacksun's body. In the wake of that battle, the Human Torch attempted to save Thomas Lightner's life by placing his body within a thermal shield that prevented his unique cells from degrading. They brought him to a hospital where he was examined by a skilled surgeon, Dr. Donald Blake, who was no stranger to unusual cosmic forces. For those who may be unaware, at the time, Donald Blake was secretly the mortal alter ego of the mighty thunder god Thor. And so he ultimately succeeded in saving Lightner's life, reversing his cellular decay, depowering him in the process. After being released from the hospital and avoiding jail time before the blackout he caused, Thomas Lightner was recruited into an organization called the Nth Man. This group was a covert subsidiary of the notorious Roxxon oil company that studied other realities, and Lightner helped them perfect their Nth projector devices, allowing them to transport objects and individuals to and from other universes. Now, I do want to note that in one alternate reality, Earth 7484, these Nth projectors were used in a scheme called Operation Purge, in which the Nth Commandos banished their world's superhuman defenders to dimensions where they would immediately perish. In the wake of that, the Roxxon of that world attempted to seize control of the United States. However, the ensuing war resulted in mass chaos that devastated the country. But I digress. Getting back to Earth 616 and the story at hand, under the codename of Operative X, Thomas Lightner infiltrated the U.S. government's alternative energy research facility, Project Pegasus, as part of a scheme to ensure Roxxon maintained their chokehold over the energy market. While there, he helped smuggle Nth projector components into the facility and ensured that a robotic duplicate of Deathlok, controlled by Roxxon, was also able to get inside. For context, the original Deathlok was a cyborg soldier from the aforementioned alternate reality Earth 7484. He eventually wound up on Earth 616 for a time and was taken into S.H.I.E.L.D. custody, but was subsequently stolen by Roxxon and brought to another of their subsidiaries, the Brand Corporation, where the robotic duplicate was created. Also, as a side note, the man who created the duplicate, Harlan Riker, was the Earth 616 counterpart to one of the individuals responsible for creating the original Deathlok back on Earth 7484. Funny how the multiverse has little idiosyncrasies like that. Also, fun fact, Harlan Riker had a brother named Simon Riker who, in more recent years, was transformed into a cyborg lycanthrope called the War Wolf. That's not really relevant to what we were talking about, but I'm not sure when else I'd have an excuse to mention the existence of a cyborg werewolf called War Wolf. Getting back to the story at hand, Project Pegasus employed some superhuman security, including Ben Grimm and Wendell Vaughn, aka Quasar, who we've talked about on the channel before. As a result, the Deathlok duplicate was utterly destroyed shortly after being discovered. In another act of sabotage, Tom Lightner released the radioactive prisoner Nuclo into the Project Pegasus facility. If you don't remember him, he was the son of World War II era heroes The Whizzer and Miss America, but because of an accident began emitting dangerous levels of radiation shortly after he was born, and had to be sealed away. In any event, Nuclo's rampage through Project Pegasus was halted by Ben Grimm and the size-changing scientist Bill Foster, known at the time as Giant Man. However, that incident served as a distraction, allowing other agents to sneak inside the facility. This infiltration team included the Grapplers, a foursome of superhuman female wrestlers, and Thundra, a warrior woman from Earth 715, who was hired to sneak more components into the facility. While this group were ultimately apprehended by Project Pegasus security, they did secretly complete their mission, allowing Lightner to finish assembling the Nth projector. Now, his actual mission was to banish the entire facility to another reality, thereby eliminating any competition for Roxxon, but first he suspected that he could use the projector to access the energies of the Dark Force dimension and use them to reactivate his Black Sun abilities. However, when he attempted to do so, something went wrong, and rather than infusing himself with Dark Force energy, he inadvertently transformed himself into a living, multi-dimensional space warp. Dubbing himself the Nth Man, Lightner began absorbing all matter around him, threatening to draw in the entire planet, starting with the Project Pegasus facility. However, one individual who was being studied there at the time was an alien named Wondar, also known as the Aquarian. And taking a step back to explain his origins, he was born on the planet Dakum in the Aquari system, but his parents, Hectu and Soja, mistakenly believed that an impending supernova would soon doom their entire world. The Dakamite Internal Security Force permanently silenced the couple in the name of peace and tranquility, but before she died, Soja succeeded in placing the infant Wondar on an interstellar rocket and launching him into space. Kept alive by the ship's life support systems, Wondar reached the Earth after about a year or more of travel, but as he approached the planet, his body was mutated by a combination of cosmic rays and solar energy. His vessel was seen streaking across the night sky by an elderly couple, but they ultimately decided not to investigate, fearing that it was some alien or foreign threat. And so after the ship crashed into a swamp in the Florida Everglades, it remained there undisturbed for over 2 decades, while Wondar's body grew into adulthood. Eventually, however, it was found by the monstrous swamp creature Man-Thing, who inadvertently unleashed a now 23-year-old Wondar from his mechanical womb. But despite having the body of an adult, his intellect and mental maturity were still akin to that of an infant. Furthermore, his exposure to cosmic radiation had endowed his body with the ability to absorb both environmental and kinetic energy, channeling it into superhuman physiology, and so he literally did not know his own strength. Suffice it to say, this got him into some trouble, including a confrontation with the Thing. However, he also befriended the Atlantean hero, Namorita, who realized that he was basically a child and came to his aid alongside her cousin Namor. Namor and Grimm also joined forces to defend Wondar from Dakamite agents who had tracked him to Earth. Wondar was subsequently examined by Mr. Fantastic, who determined that his apparent lack of intellect was not due to any physiological issues, and also discovered that if Wondar absorbed too much energy without expending any, he would involuntarily eject it in an explosive discharge. To mitigate that problem, Mr. Fantastic provided Wondar with a specially designed suit that would disperse his excess energy more safely. Grimm watched over Wondar until Namorita volunteered to take him in and effectively raise him, and while he made some progress, Wondar was later taken into S.H.I.E.L.D. custody and brought to Project Pegasus. In one of the tests conducted there, Wondar was exposed to energy from a reality-altering device called a cosmic cube. We've talked about them plenty of times on the channel before, but refer to my video on the Molecule Man for more details on exactly where cosmic cubes come from and what they are. In any event, a supervillain cult leader known as Victorious infiltrated the facility and sabotaged the experiment in an attempt to claim the cube for himself. Despite his ambitious moniker, Victorious was ultimately defeated in a battle involving Ben Grimm, Captain America, and the Man-Thing. However, his sabotage did cause Wondar to suffer an overdose of cosmic energy, overloading his neural capacity. Feeling hurt and alone, Wondar retreated into unconsciousness in an attempt to simulate the peaceful warmth of his womb-like rocket. Meanwhile, the cube's energies also affected Wondar's abilities, causing him to begin generating a power-dampening null field that negated most forms of energy within his immediate vicinity. At the same time, he maintained a connection with the cube that helped his mind develop while he slept, and awakened his earliest memories of his homeworld. He eventually awakened himself and mentally delved into the cosmic cube, completing his mental maturation while achieving a state of enlightenment and inner peace. Donning a new outfit, he renamed himself the Aquarian in reference to his native star system. Now, I will note that Wondar of Dacum and Thomas Lightner were both in Project Pegasus at the same time, and so while Wondar was becoming the Aquarian, Lightner was transformed into the Nth Man. The Aquarian attempted to use his null energy field to stop the Nth Man, but inadvertently interrupted all power to the facility, including oxygen and life support, forcing him to pull the field back. Before the power came back on, however, Thundra escaped from her cell and joined forces with Ben Grimm, Bill Foster, Quasar, and the Aquarian in a battle against the Nth Man. Dying of radiation poisoning and willing to sacrifice himself, Foster attempted to stop Lightner by leaping into him and using his Pym particle powers to cut the Nth Man off from their dimension entirely. When that failed to work, Thundra, Quasar, and Grimm helped the Aquarian reach into the Nth Man's body without being lost inside. As a result, the Aquarian was able to both save Bill Foster and to expand his null energy field inside of Lightner's body, disrupting his powers and causing his form to collapse in on itself without affecting the rest of the facility. While the heroes believed that their foe was destroyed, in truth the Nth Man was shunted into another reality and began expanding once again. He eventually engulfed and consumed that entire universe, after which, with no more matter to absorb, he collapsed in on himself again and fell into yet another reality to repeat the process several more times, destroying a total of 7 universes. Now, none of those realities had champions capable of stopping him in time, but then the Nth Man entered a universe known as Reality 712, home to a team of superheroes called the Squadron Supreme, who we've talked about on the channel before. And so we're actually going to continue that story next week when we return to that reality and continue our coverage of the Squadron Supreme. In the meantime, in Reality 616, Roxxon continued their schemes as they attempted to establish a worldwide monopoly in the energy business. The Nth Command later prepared to initiate Operation Purge on Earth 616 and banish all superhumans to toxic dimensions, much like their counterparts had done on Earth 7484. However, after visiting that other reality and learning what happened there, Captain America was able to foil their plans before they even began, by destroying the device that powered all of their Nth projectors, creating a major point of divergence between those two timelines. The leader of the Nth Command, Albert DeVore, was arrested by S.H.I.E.L.D. in the wake of that conflict. However, he later resurfaced and joined forces with his counterpart from yet another universe, Reality 721, in an interdimensional money-making scheme. In short, the two DeVores created a vacation business that catered to residents of Earth 721, whose counterparts on Earth 616 had superhuman powers. By passing through an atomic resequencer, such individuals could gain their counterparts' abilities while visiting Earth 616. As a side note, while the numerical designation system for different realities originates from the Captain Britain Corps, the residents of Earth 721 referred to their own world as Earth A and Earth 616 as Earth B. These Earth A imposters sometimes did things that their 616 counterparts wouldn't have, leading to some confusion, with the most infamous example being an incident in which the Jen Walters of Earth A slept with the Juggernaut of Earth 616. In any event, that whole scheme was eventually uncovered, landing Albert DeVore in legal trouble once again. Okay heroes, that's all I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. Little bit of a shorter one this week, but that just means we've got a more substantial one in the pipeline for next week. If you enjoyed this though, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this weekend, so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!